Greetings all! And today, I hope you don't mind, but I would like to talk about something different from the norm than you might be expecting. I've been talking about Pokemon on this channel since the very beginning of it all, and given how long this has been going on, you might imagine that sometimes it can be hard to just not create content, but also make sure that it connects to the franchise in some shape or form. Well, today, I would like to change that, at least slightly, and while talking a bit about Pokemon still, I want to switch gears and do something that I've never done before. I recently acquired a book containing the life's work of an author that I initially didn't know a great deal about, but whom I now hold a great deal of respect for, more than most people might likely imagine. Today, ladies and gentlemen, I want to step back from Pokemon for a bit and talk about the father of weird fiction as we know it today. A man that gave us monsters beyond the scope of human understanding and paved the road that lay between that which we cannot understand and that which we are too small in the grand scheme of the universe and beyond to ever understand fully. Today, ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk about one man, a man named H.P. Lovecraft.
So you may be thinking to yourself, just what exactly this man has done to inspire me to devote an entire video of this sort of length about him? And the answer is a bit complicated, to be honest. I've always had a fascination with science fiction and horror, and I'd known the man as an author for a while, but I never had the chance to actually dive into his work in extensive detail. However, I recently acquired a book from Barnes & Noble. They are not sponsoring this video, by the way, but I give them a shout out to them regardless, as they have lovely compilation volumes for all sorts of authors. And as you can see, it is the complete life's work of the man, compiled into a single book for those looking to really dive into it all. And I did. All of it. And in all honesty, it is a travesty that more people don't take the time to look through what this man created on this planet before he left this world for another. I genuinely feel inspired by the work he created. Not just for the work itself, but for the mind behind it. This man wrote like no other man or woman I have ever known, and even today, modern additions to his work have never been able to really capture the same essence that I have felt with him, in my opinion. His effect on me, to be blunt, has left me with a burning desire to talk about him in any way that I could. And even though I use this channel for Pokemon mainly, this is just one interlude that I could not let myself go without talking to you all about.
First, I want to take a brief look at the life of the man and what led him to become the author that he is so well known for being today.
Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born in his family home on August 20th, 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, the only child of Winfield Scott Lovecraft and Sarah Susan Lovecraft, who were both of English descent. With his father institutionalized at a young age, he was left in the sole care of his mother, who doted on him constantly throughout her life, with his grandfather becoming a father figure to Lovecraft in this time, Lovecraft himself later noting that his grandfather became the center of my entire universe. The man, who often traveled to manage his business, maintained correspondence by letter with the young Lovecraft who, by the age of 3, was already proficient at reading and writing. At the age of approximately 5.5 years old, Howard started to have nightmares that later informed his fictional writings. Specifically, he began to have recurring nightmares of beings referred to as the Night Gaunts, entities that would later appear in his own writings. As his family and personal life changed over the years, and for the worse after his grandfather died and the monetary fortune dwindled from falling businesses, Lovecraft found himself at least excelling in school as he battled through various health crises, particularly bouts of Sydenham's chores, and while he kept his interest in science and the like, he never managed to attend university despite saying that he would, instead turning to writing and amateur journalism as a way of life. His earliest published works made it into the publication in the 1910s, and in the 1920s, he would truly begin to create the world of the Cthulhu mythos that he's now so well known for. Lovecraft immersed himself in the world of amateur journalism for most of his initial years in that work, being an advocate for amateurism's superiority to commercialism, as he defined commercialism as writing for what he considered lowbrow publications for pay. This was contrasted with his view of professional publication, which is what he called writing for what he considered respectable journals and publishers. His work continued through various losses and tragedies, as well as marriage, but also managed to attain venerable positions in the United Amateur Press Association over time, making a bit of a name for himself in the process. Sadly, his life would come to an end abruptly on March 15, 1937, when he died of terminal cancer of the small intestine, having only gotten a check on it the month before his death due to a personal fear of doctors, leaving no direct descendants of his own to carry on his legacy in that fashion. Lovecraft's grandfather encouraged him at a young age to have an appreciation of literature, especially classical literature and English poetry, not just helping to raise him as a child, but also educate him not only in the classics but also in original weird tales of winged horrors and deep, low, moaning sounds, which he created for his grandfather's entertainment. Lovecraft himself guessed that they originated from Gothic novelists like Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, and Charles Maturin. It was also during this period that Lovecraft was introduced to some of his earliest literary influences, like the Rhymes of the Ancient Mariner illustrated by Gustave Doré, 1001 Nights, Thomas Bulfinch's Age of Fable, and Ovid's Metamorphosis. Lovecraft's earliest known literary works are written at the age of 7, and were poems restyling the Odyssey and other Greco-Roman mythological stories. Lovecraft later wrote that during his childhood, he was fixated on the Greco-Roman pantheon and briefly accepted them as genuine expressions of divinity, foregoing his Christian upbringing. He recalled, in fact, that at 5 years old, being told Santa Claus did not exist and retorted by asking why God is not equally a myth, which is honestly just an incredible thing to say as a child that young. At the age of 8, he also took a keen interest in the sciences, particularly astronomy and chemistry, which would go on to serve as a massive influence in the work he would eventually become known for. In 1902, astronomy especially became a guiding influence for his worldviews and remained as such for most of his life, and the works of Edgar Allan Poe, among others like Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood, as well as the efforts of the Puritans and the decadent and aesthetic movements in art, would become heavy hitters of inspiration for much of his work. Moreover, his work was informed and heavily influenced by advances in the sciences of biology, astronomy, geology, and physics, especially in the way that he saw humanity as insignificant, powerless, and doomed to the greater whole of the universe, and his own vivid dreams would serve not just as an influence for his writing, but also as the direct source for a few of his published stories. While Lovecraft's work might be held in high regard in modern times, much like revolutionaries and great figures in other fields like Nikola Tesla and Vincent van Gogh, Lovecraft's work wasn't really appreciated in the way that it was today by any stretch of the imagination in his lifetime, though this isn't to say that he was completely unrecognized in his time. Many of his stories were indeed published in journals like Weird Tales in his time, but the truth of the matter is that they were treated just like any other bit, so while they sometimes did prove to be quite popular and allowed them to make a living of a sort, it is very much a case where people didn't really understand what they had in their hands at the time. There are a lot of reasons this can be contributed to, but for me, there are 3 things that stand out as the biggest likely contributors. First of all, as with many in the literary field, it is hard to know when you have something that's truly revolutionary when it first comes out, as you often have little to really compare it to. The first of anything is rarely seen into the full effects of its power until time is given the chance for people to look back on it and see just what it is that they have been missing out on. Second, the nature of Lovecraft's work wasn't necessarily the first of its kind, but he is considered to be the father of weird fiction as a whole because of his ability to combine various forms of Gothic, horror, and scientific literature and use them to weave something new and definitive in its stance, which I will cover later on in this video, and in creating his unique style of diction and imagination. However, the product of the mixture was not only something that wasn't greatly understood at the time, but it also wasn't seen for the full potential it had because of cultural differences and the way the literature was absorbed and created in his time. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, Lovecraft and his somewhat esoteric style of journalism and writing regarding his work in some instances meant that the inner machinations of his mind in creating it all has only become clear in hindsight, and had it not been for people that knew him well, most of the thoughts and reasoning behind his creations would not be known, as it was only after his death that such information was made available to the public. It is also interesting to note here that Lovecraft did not get all of his ideas from his work from his own mind, as not only was he inspired in his works by that of other authors, but was known from time to time to take what had been made by others and use it for his own purposes. In other words, if he saw a name, place, or character from another author that he found to be profoundly likable to himself, he would find a way to incorporate it into his own written work. And while nowadays that would likely not lead to the best of outcomes, in his time this is actually a common practice and something that he took to quite readily in truth, as did many other writers and scholars of his time. In those days, it seems it was seen as flattering provided that the resultant work was good, and one of the best examples I can speak of here is the use of Hastur from The King in Yellow, written by Robert W. Chambers, an entity that seemed to be the infector of madness and existed as a being above anything any mortal mind could ever truly imagine. Hastur would be mentioned a few times in Lovecraft's work, and while the character got little more than a name drop in these instances, this was enough for the entity to eventually become part of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. Later authors would use Lovecraft's own work in much the same way, expanding upon the Cthulhu mythos with their own works out of inspiration from him, and it is why said mythos is as massive as it is today. It is kind of funny to think that the broader reach of what we see as part of that mythos was created both during and after Lovecraft's time as a patchwork of cherry-picking and borrowing, but I think that this serves as a testament to both the compelling nature of Lovecraft's own influences and the sheer power and strength of foundation he himself set for writers that would come after him to expand upon this world, even if it wasn't done intentionally.
Now, as much can be said in a purely positive light about Lovecraft, before I start to talk on his work, I feel that it is only right for me to also mention some of the more personal aspects of him that tend to be controversial in the eyes of many.
As far as his personal politics are concerned, Lovecraft started out as a Tory as a result of his conservative upbringing, and while he supported the Republican Party his entire life, he also believed that if society entered a time where the lower middle classes would suffer, the rich and affluent would use their influence and resources to help bring them out of whatever hole they might be put in. However, when the Great Depression hit, and Lovecraft instead saw the rich and powerful hoarding what they could instead of working to try and bring the US out of it, he became a socialist for the rest of his life. Plus, in his eyes, it was a community of the most intelligent people in the country that deserved to help run and regulate the country, and not just those that had great power and influence. As far as religion goes, Lovecraft did start out as a Protestant, but his values changed in accordance with his exposure to classical literature and talks of old, and it was his introduction to space that ultimately made him an atheist for the majority of his life. This is what led him to take on the view of the insignificance of humanity in the greater cosmos, an attribute that eventually became a key component of his later and most well-known writings. But the one aspect of Lovecraft that stands out more sharply than any other as the modern context is that he was, sadly, well, a racist. Now, the sort of views that he had were pretty common to the time and place where he grew up and lived, but for his early years of life and as a student writer, there's little way of getting around the fact that he was a white supremacist, though I will at least say that it was never to the extent of wanting to actually hurt others physically in any way. He also didn't exactly find favor with all white people either, as he had a special fondness for those of British and English descent in general. As he would get older and would travel across the world for his work, his viewpoints on these matters would soften noticeably, and he became a proponent of cultures keeping to their traditions and investing into them, a contrast to his preference for assimilation in his younger years. Though this never got rid of his prejudiced views entirely. His story, The Horrid Red Hook, is an unfortunate example of his views at their worst.
With all that said, I would next like to talk about his work itself, specifically the themes that define his work and the way in which they have not only shaped his writings, but just as importantly here, how they have impacted me and the way in which I believe they have contributed to his greater notoriety as an author in more modern times.
While it might not have been a major part of his early works, the one theme that runs through most strongly throughout Lovecraft's works, and that he is most well known for, is his approach to cosmicism. It is often misconstrued that Lovecraft was a pessimist in the way that he viewed the position of humanity in the greater cosmos, possibly as a counter to his initial religious upbringing, but this was not the case at all. As noted just a bit ago, he actually became an atheist fully when he was exposed to space for the first time as a person, and in truth, his views instead lay on a much more neutral standing than is often depicted. Yes, it is true that in his view the human race was insignificant, not just to the greater cosmos, but also to much more powerful mysterious entities that are normally beyond the plane of human understanding, but it is more of a case of indifference than hostility. In truth, we matter so little to greater beings out in the cosmos that they really don't interact with us much at all, instead choosing to ignore those that otherwise exist outside the sphere of influence. Moreover, for the protagonists of the stories where this theme is prominent, it is not something that is learned about as some sort of revelation through each story, instead being something that the protagonist is already aware of to some degree or another, the subsequent tale then serving to confirm their beliefs on the matter. In this way, Lovecraft explores this theme with the idea of showing not something that is meant to downplay humanity, but how that we are just a part of a much larger picture of the universe, and should accept that we are not the greatest part of what we can see out beyond the reach of our planet. This also then ties into a different theme of his work, and in turn the handling of it by those that bring us through these various stories, and that is the way that knowledge is handled in his tales. For the most part in our daily lives, having knowledge is often considered to be a good thing, as the more the people know, the more they can use the information to better their lives and the lives of all those around them. But Lovecraft makes it clear that there are simply some things that people are better off not knowing about for their own sake, often using the Necronomicon as a plot device and source of said knowledge in his stories. This is not in the sense that it could actually lead to the death as one might initially think, but instead is focused on the effect that knowledge has on the position one has in the view of their life. Forbidden knowledge is a theme that is featured in literature in this fashion on a not uncommon basis, but Lovecraft combined it with cosmicism in order to show there was not the knowledge itself that would drive others mad, but instead the weight of it regarding characters realizing the true limits of their purpose, a moment where in truth they understand the full insignificance of their existence and the weight that places on them. We as human beings are driven by their determination and our belief that what we do will actually matter to someone, but Lovecraft's stories show what can happen when that resolve is broken with the knowledge of just how little our actions actually do matter. And this is where many of the popular ideas of entities beyond normal understanding causing madness in others really comes from. Not in literally driving others mad, but revealing to them where they really lay on the cosmic scale of importance, and in turn, how absurdly little their existence actually matters. Another important attribute that features in Lovecraft's best-known works is also one that is often misconstrued and analyzed incorrectly, and this is his stance on the decline of civilization, and not just that of humanity. In his time, Lovecraft believed that the human race as a civilization was already on the decline, but instead of focusing on this entirely in his work, he instead used it to show both the idea of ancient entities beyond human understanding and how they already have met such a fate. No civilization is permanent in its standing, no matter how powerful or advanced they may be, and Lovecraft shows this in great detail within stories like The Cult of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, and The Shadow Out of Time. We are introduced to entire races that did indeed once live as great civilizations on this planet that are far more advanced than humanity ever has reached, even in modern context, and we're also given clear indications that these creatures, these ancient races, all had their time, but for one reason or another, they declined due to changing aspects of the world and the planet itself, like climate change, and in turn were lost to time, the ruins of their former cities and bodies often being all that is left of them. Whether it be through combat or the natural decline of land sunken into the ocean or exposed to the frozen poles as examples, these entities have left behind limited traces of their existence, as we humans are then forced to accept that we are not the first great civilization in the world, merely the latest. And moreover, though declined, they are rarely ever completely gone, leaving the chance for the humanity to come into contact with them once again, though not always in a way that favors our chances of survival.
Science features as a major part of his works as well, and as a fellow man of science, this is where I truly have to applaud Lovecraft and his incorporation of it all into his work. Though, funnily enough, he uses it counter to the way that you might be expecting in this instance.
In many of his later stories, Lovecraft would use science in two ways. First of all, the use of science in his work was meant to help give it greater weight and significance to the reality that we are all a part of, outside the worlds that his stories occupy. While Lovecraft held science in high regards, he never believed that in a literary form it should be kept as part of a grounded reality. Instead, he would use it to illustrate the second point here, namely that the advances of technology of his time, which made into a lot of his later works, were used too in the form of a backdrop of sorts for the fantastic nature of his tales. In other words, he would use real-world science in order to help demonstrate just how beyond its reach understanding of the alien race and ancient entities in the stories actually is, to help accentuate and make more prominent the notion that the entities that his protagonists are encountering truly are beyond the limits of human understanding in a very real sense. This is where the idea of these entities being unknowable really comes from, but the context is important because it is not delivered in an exaggerated manner. Lovecraft deliberately did his research and made it clear in his writings just how limited science still was in understanding the greater entities out there, illustrating the limits of human understanding as a species, rather than just making these entire creatures seem like mysteries to only the characters in his tales. Mathematics further served as a valuable addition to this, using the same theme of comparing this mode of understanding with what alien entities and their protagonists encounter, and showing how far away they are from us in that regard. There's a special repetition of the use of non-Euclidean geometry and the construction of the cities and other architecture of these alien beings present in his work, giving even the abodes and worshipping centers of these alien entities a sense of confusion and bafflement, structures that seem like nothing a human mind would ever think or be able to actually construct in any way, highlighting the disparity between the human race and the entities they stumble upon here. It also serves as the main feature in the dreams in the witch house, showing that math itself can stand on its own as a source of terror and intrigue.
Lastly, as far as major themes go, I would like to briefly talk about the importance of setting in Lovecraft's literature, and once more, there are really two levels to this.
Lovecraft is known to choose very specific locations for his stories, as it helped to not only ground the stories in reality, but to cement them in a place that any person walking down the street can visit and live within, to take the reader right to that location and place them in the viewpoint of whatever danger or happenings might be going down within Lovecraft's stories. They are often connected to a specific New England setting that fans of Lovecraft have come to call Lovecraft Country, using both fictitious and real locations to set the stage for a story and take the reader into these lands that may not be that far from them, or otherwise beyond their physical reach. Even the fictitious locations in these stories within these settings are sometimes still based on real locations, so it is clear that adding that balance between realism and intangibility was important for Lovecraft to set the proper mood and background for his work. At the same time, however, there is another layer that must be breached here, and that is the focus that he places on specific locations in his work that defy the understanding of the reader, often existing as the homes for entities that features as aliens or otherwise otherworldly within Lovecraft's work. These locations serve as the sites where the fantastical nature of his stories are rooted, and include the likes of Kadath, a forbidden ancient city known to be a home of sorts for the likes of Nyarlathotep, Rhea, the ancient city and home of Cthulhu, the Plateau of Leng, a place that once housed the city and dwellings of the Outer Things in Antarctica, Innsmouth, a town that is the home of the worshippers of Dagon, known as the Deep Ones, and the planet Yugoth, the home of the Migo, and a stopping point for the Great Old Ones before they head towards our way in the solar system, just to name a few. These locations serve to give us new settings to explore within our own grounded reality, combining the real and fantastical elements of its most well-known tales in order to place the reader in a position that is uncomfortable, sandwiched between a grounded reality and a land that is where no normal humans are meant to be, to echo the feelings and sentiments of the humans present in these stories. And I think it carries this effect on the reader both intelligently and effectively in context.
In speaking on all of these themes, it is now pertinent that we finally touch upon Lovecraft's connection to the horror genre as a whole, as that is the aspect of his writing that has seeped the deepest into society through osmosis.
The actual term Lovecraftian horror is of course a posthumous one, as it took decades for Lovecraft's work to be appreciated the way it is today, but it's also not just a term thrown around with his work and those that have added onto it. It does actually mean something. In short, Lovecraftian horror is a unique blend of horror that combines eldritch horror and cosmic horror as a single package. We have already touched upon the cosmic horror aspect within the theme of cosmicism, but this is turned into a cosmic horror when it's applied directly to the characters in his tales, the weight of it all being something that scars them mentally, and sometimes even physically, overwhelming both them and the reader with the understanding of just how little we really matter in the grand scheme of things, how insignificant we are in the face of the grander cosmos and those who live within it. Eldritch horror, on the other hand, refers to the horror associated with entities and occurrences that are mainly unearthly or otherwise not of this world, supernatural even to some degree. This aspect is what pushes Lovecraft's work out of science fiction and into a realm where the vastness is not just that, vast, but also genuinely unknowable with human understanding and science and logic. The entities and events in these tales are not just out of this world, but outside human understanding by conventional logic, beings that defy the laws of science to create a terror that strikes at the very core of humanity itself, and why we should be terrified of what else may be out there, even if it may be indifferent to our existence. This conveys a unique setting in the stories that makes us question whether or not the reality we live in is the true reality, and in many of them, it is inferred or just outright stated that we are not living in the true reality, but a dream of it in a sense. This sort of combined existential fear is what makes Lovecraft's work so distinct from both writers of his time and those in the modern day, and demonstrates the brilliance of the man in his efforts to make others question their own existence and reality through fear of what the human mind was never meant to see, let alone know. From here, I now want to talk a little bit about some of the numerous entities that are found within Lovecraft's work, and while I could just list off some of them right off a wiki page, that's not something I really want to do, mainly because there are a lot to cover, and I just want to cover the ones that have had the most impact on me, and also because that would just be lazy. So instead, I want to delve into how these entities actually make me feel, since that is objectively the point of most importance in discussing their impact on those that are exposed to them in Lovecraft's stories. The Night Gaunt originates from the dream quest of unknown Kadith, and exists as entities with black and smooth whale-like skin, long slender humanoid bodies, curved horns, leather bat-like wings, and a black expanse of flesh in place of an actual face. These entities don't really have a lot of background history to them in the canon of Lovecraft's work, as they're one of the more minor entities that are described in said work, existing as the minions on the outer god Nodens, but they get a special mention right off the bat as they were actually the first entity of the Cthulhu mythos that Lovecraft ever saw, having haunted his dreams as a child before eventually making their way to the pages of his writing decades later. As for how they make me feel, I have to be honest and say that, as simple as their designs may be to some, I think that plays into their favor as unsettling, as they tend to fly in swarms and thus use the power of terror by numbers to overwhelm others. Moreover, the fact they don't have a face makes it hard to read them or get a sense of expression out of them, which is a big issue for me, thus alienating them from the realm of communication initially and making it that much harder to make sense of them and their actions. Next, we have the Shoggoth, who debuted in the story at the Mountains of Madness. These entities exist as sentient blobs of self-shaping gelatinous flesh, something like a giant amoeba, typically 15 feet in diameter if shaped into a sphere, though larger and smaller versions do exist. They are capable of shaping themselves to whatever organs or structures they find necessary at the moment, though in the usual state they tend to sport a broiling profusion of eyes, mouths, and tendrils, with which they are able to move at exceptional speeds. In Lovecraft's work, they are typically bred and used as a slave tool raised by several different civilizations in order to build the amazing non-Euclidean architecture that features prominently in many of his most well-known works, and are suited for this job well, as they are often mind-controlled through telepathy through their creators, and able to morph their forms to accomplish whatever goals are given to them. Though it has been seen that they can develop a sense of sentience and ego over time if allowed to mutate naturally, making them a threat to even those that use them for work. These entities not only look incredibly odd to me, silly as some might think them to be, but the fact that they are designed for imitating and transforming into anything they need to be makes them really unsettling. It's even been confirmed that powerful variants called Shoggoth Lords can actually mimic humans almost perfectly, so the idea of them being among us and impossible to discern from others is more than a bit unnerving. The Deep Ones technically debuted in the untitled work of Lovecraft now known as Dagon, but they are more prominently known for the central role in the story In the Shadow of Innsmouth, and are distinct from the humanoid yet frog-like forms, either taking on this state naturally or as the offspring of humans and other Deep Ones, maturing into the true form only later in life. These entities serve as the followers of the god-beast Dagon and Cthulhu in some iterations, and their purpose is quite simple. Made with humans to make more of their kind in the hopes of eventually taking over the world for Dagon, and especially the sleeping deity Cthulhu in later works. And they do this by making deals with poor towns and cities to bring abundant fish and gold sculptures to sell to make these towns prosperous and ready to make more of the Deep Ones in exchange. These unsettling creatures are probably the most important of cults in the Lovecraft mythos in an official sense, and while I do at least find that humanoid forms a bit easier to take on than other entities, the fact that they rarely ever die naturally and have a sinister hold over whatever town or city they can get their amphibious hands on makes them quite uncomfortable to confront, and not a race I would really want to be near, no matter how human the voices and words may sound. The Migo are one of the lesser-known entities of Lovecraft's creation, but I find them quite interesting because of the nature of their work and existence within our own solar system. These entities debuted in the story The Whisperer in Darkness, wherein they have the appearance of pinkish creatures about 5 feet long with crustaceous bodies bearing vast pairs of dorsal fins or membranous wings and several sets of articulated limbs, despite apparently being fungal creatures at their core, with a sort of convoluted ellipsoid structure covered with a multitude of very short antennae where a head would ordinarily be. It is noted, though, that these creatures come in a variety of different forms in various tales beyond Lovecraft's original work. These entities exist as a scientifically and technologically advanced race, with a particularly sophisticated grasp of surgical techniques and neuroscience, and are known to be the colonizers of the planet Yugoth at the edge of our solar system, not coincidentally right where Pluto is, as the planet was officially described and categorized in Lovecraft's time mere weeks before work on The Whisper in Darkness was actually started, and have taken the planet into their personal care as it is now the major stopping point for the great old ones beyond our home on the way to Earth from places unknown. There is honestly a lot to say about these creatures here and the role they play in the expanded mythos, but for me what's important is that their stance in humanity is a bit hard to really grasp, as while they seem willing to interact with us, they also prefer to do so to keep any knowledge of their existence a total secret, and will commit whatever nefarious deeds are necessary to both silence us that know too much about them, and simultaneously expose them to knowledge that would otherwise destroy weak-minded souls. This alone is a terrifying notion to me, as while it won't spoil exactly how that goes down for the protagonists of the story they debuted in, the thought of them coming after you because you know about them, and yet punishing you with more knowledge than you can handle, is a powerful action of too much of a good thing. As much as I love to learn, perhaps there indeed are some things better left not known for the sake of one's own life. We can next take a look at the Elder Things, a race of alien creatures whose title might not exactly make them sound all that distinct, but their forms more than show why such an ominous title is given to them. They originate from the story at the Mountains of Madness, and existed in detail as sapient, radially symmetric entities, with characteristics of animals and vegetables alike. They measure 6 feet end to end, 3 5/10 feet at central diameter, tapering to 1 foot at each end. They are shaped like a barrel with 5 bulging ridges in place of staves, and lateral breakages, as of thinnest stalks, at their equator in the middle of their ridges. The top appendages of their form has a head adorned with 5 eyes, 5 eating tubes instead of cilia for seeing without light. The bottom, on the other hand, has 5 limbs used for walking and other forms of locomotion. The beings also have 5 leathery, fan-like retractable wings and 5 sets of branching tentacles that sprout from their torso. Both the tentacles and the slits housing their folded wings were spaced at regular intervals about their bodies, and they further had 5 lobed brains and many ganglial centers with centers that went beyond what humans can otherwise normally experience. As you can see from that, a lot of detail is known about these creatures, and it's a rare volume that makes it very easy to visualize their forms. These entities were not originally from Earth in any way, having come to our planet to colonize it as a home of refuge and isolation from other entities out in the vastness of the cosmos, to try and live here in peace. The creatures used engineered Shoggoth in order to build vast cities on the planet where they can dwell in peace, and were known to have been very gifted in terms of intelligence, having a thriving culture and writing that can strangely be understood even by humans. Sadly, the race was the subject of attack by the followers of Cthulhu and other alien races in their time, and this only got worse when the Shoggoth they were using for slave labor mutated and gained sentience, rebelling against their creators in turn. From there, the changing of the planet's climate and geography, as seen in Antarctica becoming frozen at the South Pole where it lays today, served as the final blow and killed the race entirely. While they might have had one of the most unique and terrifying forms that any of Lovecraft's entities have ever been seen with, I have to say that I feel great pity for these entities, as they really only wanted to come to Earth to live in peace, and given that they are extremely hard to kill, their shockless slaves resorting to decapitation as the only way to actually destroy them, it makes me sad to know that we were never able to interact with them in their heyday, as I feel that they generally would have been a positive and enlightening trait to interact with and learn from. The great race of Yith, who debuted in The Shadow Out of Time, are another example of one of the strangest and most compelling entities within the works of Lovecraft to me, and are distinct from other life forms because they don't really have a true definitive form, instead existing as the entities of a somewhat intangible nature that can possess the forms of ancient life forms on Earth in order to take control of and wield a physical body. In their initial state as they revealed to us in the debut story, these creatures resemble large cones with a muscular foot for locomotion and 4 extensible arms with tentacles protruding from the apex. 2 of these arms ended in claws or pincers, the third terminated in 4 clustered trumpet-like organs, and the fourth was topped with a spherical yellow head, with 3 dark eyes, 4 stalked flower-like hearing organs on top, and a number of green tentacles dangling beneath, with blood that was dark green and very thick. Similar to the Elder Things, the Yith were aliens that came to our planet for the sake of peace and prosperity 200 million years ago, and like the Elder Things, were able to build massive cities for the civilization, where they developed a sense of architecture and rich culture with a written language, and were only rendered extinct by a race of creatures known as the Flying Polyps, whom they had been at war at for eons. What made them unique, however, was that they had the power to project their minds into other beings to possess them, and can do so even through time and space. The main protagonist of the debut story is the victim of such an action, although it is not done out of malice, but as a way to survive in some form or another. Either way, it leads him to become enthralled in learning more about them, with a twist that is sure to strike deep at the heart of existentialism for those reading through the tale. Much as with the Elder Things, I feel great pity for these creatures, as it is shown that they too are incredibly intelligent and could have taught humanity much in their time, but they have the added benefit of being able to actually do so with their telepathic powers across space and time, and there is joy to know that they already have plans to have their entire race project their minds into a race of beasts in the future, long after the end of humanity. And even in The Shadow Out of Time, we can see that they wish us no harm, merely to interact with us in whatever way they can, to make their presence known to at least some degree. The next entity may be a bit of an odd choice for some, as it isn't technically a true entity in its own right, but it is the subject of one of Lovecraft's most well-known creations, and that would be the aptly named Color, from The Color Out of Space. This entity, if you can even call it that, has no real physical description for itself, as it is a strange force or power that crash-landed on Earth contained inside of a meteor, that then begins to infect everything living within and around the farmhouse, transforming every living thing in the process into something strange and alien with no remorse for what it actually does. It does this through horrible mutations, madness, and the rendering of animal meat tasteless and inedible, just a surface glimpse of what happens to anything infected by the color. Eventually, all becomes almost crystallized, and eventually disintegrates into a grey powder, the story ending in a brilliant conclusion that is as much baffling as it is terrifying, and worth being wary of. I honestly love this story, because it doesn't need to rely on a true entity of any sort in order to scare the living hell out of you, instead playing off the idea of the unexplainable itself as the sole source of fear and intrigue, and the story does a fantastic job of conveying that in practice. Alright, now it's time to really get into some of the heavy hitters of Lovecraft's lore, starting with the terrible and terrifying entity known as Nyarlathotep. This entity does not really have a discrete true form that is labeled as such, as it takes on many different forms not just in Lovecraft's original work, but throughout the expanded universe that has spread out and grown from his work after his death. Known by many names, perhaps most famously as the Crawling Chaos, Nyarlathotep is an outer god that serves not just as a source of fear, but a primary antagonist in more than just a single story, as it is probably the only true outer god that hasn't been fully exiled out of the realm of human understanding, instead roaming the world of both the physical reality and the dream world among others, and interacts with humanity on a startling number of occasions. In fact, while the other outer gods and many other Lovecraftian entities use a language that is usually beyond the capacity for humanity to understand, Nyarlathotep can speak English or whatever language it needs to in order to communicate directly with humans, and it can even pass for a human being with a number of different disguises, whatever will serve its works and purpose the best. It is an incredibly active individual as well, working at all hours in order to act as the mouthpiece of the other outer gods, acting and speaking in their stead while on Earth. What makes him especially sinister is that, unlike many others in the Cthulhu mythos, he actually has no desire for the death and destruction of humanity. His main focus is instead simply driving humanity into madness as they join with him and the others, and he does so with great fervor whenever possible. For me, the fact that he doesn't actually wish for the destruction of the human race is slightly comforting, but he is a devious monster that happily drives those that encounter him to the point beyond human sanity, and given that he acts in the stead and the will of the other outer gods, means that there is little hope of predicting his actions, making for a terrible and genuinely sinister entity in the process. Next, we have the entity known as Yog-Sothoth, a powerful outer god whose name was first mentioned in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, but mainly is known as the hidden main antagonist of the Dunwich Horror, and is without a doubt one of the most powerful entities in the original Cthulhu mythos. Yog-Sothoth itself does not have a single major form that it takes with others, having many different forms at its disposal, but most often his true form comes in the form of a mass of glowing orbs, with eyes or tendrils in some versions, and in others just the orbs. This intangible form is unsettling not just for a seemingly simple form, but also because it is likely only a glimpse of what the creature is truly like to others of its kind. Yog-Sothoth itself is not really here to cause trouble, but he does so by the nature of his existence, as he seemingly is the literal living gateway between the reality we know and the space where the other outer gods lay, and thus is the most direct way for humans to engage with these entities, if they feel compelled to do so. His intangible nature means that it's also hard to understand just what he wants, but what gets me more than anything is that this monster has the power to actually impregnate humans to make hybrids of a sort, which serves the main focal act that puts the tale of the Dunwich Horror into action. That alone to me is a terrifying thing to see, and the different ways this can affect any humans born of his parentage serves as a terrifying example of what can happen when humans and the unknowable come together to try and make something new with each other. Now, let's take a look at the one that I'm sure many of you were waiting for, and that is the monster that's become the poster child for all of Lovecraft's work, the entity known as Cthulhu, the entity that starts the focal point for the Call of Cthulhu. Unlike many of his brethren in a sense, Cthulhu does have a discrete physical form to him, with the appearance of a fusion between an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature. His octopus-like head adorned with a face with a mass of feelers, alongside a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodding his claws on his hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. He is one of the few entities in Lovecraft's literature that is a genuine cult devoted to him, not just the deep ones, but throngs of worshippers of an unknown volume across the breadth of the earth, all serving to his cause and waiting for him to awaken from a nearly eternal slumber that he has been in for millions of years, imprisoned within the ancient city of Rhea, submerged below the surface of the sea. It is believed in ancient times, long before the rise of humanity, the monster came to Earth and claimed it as his own world, with his followers coming forth from there, but changes in the geography and climate of the planet eventually submerged the architecture of the cities that he and his followers built, not unlike those made by the Elder Things and the great race of Yith, though the former he had great hatred towards in claiming the Earth as their own. Due to these events, however, Cthulhu himself lay in a deep, death-like slumber from which nothing seems to be able to wake him from. But it is thought that if enough begin to follow him and worship him, he will eventually wake from that slumber, and if he does, it will be the end of humanity entirely. Now, as much as this is a terrifying notion that his awakening will directly bring about the end of our entire world and society, and thus is a direct and terrifying enemy of the human race, I find him less horrifying than the others because he has sadly become the subject of much watering down as he's become a part of mainstream society. The fact that he is the one great old one that actively wishes to destroy humanity is belittled by his overexposure in the media, but at the very least the fact that he does actively wish to destroy us, more than any other, does make one pause in concern for the possibility of his mere existence. We've got some familiar tomfoolery to follow this, for as much as people recognize Cthulhu in popular media, his half-brother gets far less attention, and it's a shame, because his half-brother may potentially be a far greater threat to not just humanity, but all that wander into his realm of existence. He is also one of the few entities that Lovecraft borrowed from a different author before said entity ended up becoming ingrained within his Cthulhu mythos, and that is a monster that goes by many names, including him who is not to be named, and the King in Yellow, the great old one named Hastur. Hastur takes on a number of different forms like some deities, but he is often seen as a figure of some human-like state, shrouded in a robe of brilliant yellow cloth, a color that is meant to symbolize both insanity and decadence. Living within the ancient city of Carcosa, Hastur in his story originally came from the book The King in Yellow, in which he served as a source of insanity to all those that interacted with him, even being the true form of a play of the same name, whose first act can be played readily, but whose second act dooms any that read it to insanity and death, either by murder or suicide. It is uncertain exactly whether Hastur truly hates humanity like his half-brother, but at the very least the fact that some like Nyarlathotep refused to speak his true name, instead creating other titles like him who is not to be named, is a testimony to the fear and power that he must exude, even in the presence of other powerful Lovecraftian entities. I can't sadly say a great deal on Hastur here because of how little he is talked about by Lovecraft in his own writings, but from what I have been able to gather from other sources, he is like Nyarlathotep in that he does not wish for humanity to be destroyed, instead wishing to bring them under the folds of madness and with him beyond the physical reality of mankind. And given that he seemingly has little issues interacting with humans that come into his realm in any way, he makes for not just a scary, but honestly intimidating figure, whose mere presence is likely the death knell for others that dare to enter into his home. The last of Lovecraft's entities that I would like to mention here is also by no coincidence the most powerful of them all, an entity that is so beyond human understanding that its mere presence or sight would be enough to destroy the mind and soul of any mortal that dared to gaze upon him. And that is the grand creator of everything that has ever existed and will ever exist, Azathoth. First being mentioned in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadith, there sadly isn't a great deal that can be said about this monster's form, as it is so unknown that its intangibility goes beyond even what other similar monsters could hope to show, a being that's not only omniscient and omnipotent, but also the genuine creator of the reality that humans seem to exist in. To us and others in the stories of the Cthulhu mythos, this world that we live in is merely a dream of the great Azathoth, as that being exists in a paradoxical state of eternal sleep and yet eternal creation and life, the realm of chaos where no human dreams reach, being one that only other Lovecraftian gods and entities and those related to them can ever enter or understand. A realm that will mentally and even physically destroy any mortal soul that dares to cross into the plane to gaze upon him. Ironically, the fear of the monster is not shared by those that actually know him, with even the likes of Nyarlathotep having little respect for the blind idiot god he serves as a messenger for, which is honestly kind of funny to think about, but that would be the issue at hand. Azathoth's sense of thought or self-awareness might as well be in question as the machinations of his mind serve as the literal foundation for our reality, and yet are so far removed from understanding that there is little hope of concrete understanding ever coming true. As for me, well, as odd as it may seem, I feel like fearing this entity in any real form isn't something that I can actually do. He may be a stand-in for the god that many other religions are based and worship around, but Azathoth generally cares so little about the human race and others that whatever consequences it has to inflict upon the souls of others are fleeting at best, and if he truly is both omniscient and omnipotent, knowing and seeing all across space, time, and everything else beyond it, he is the whole of existence in every sense of the word. And while that might pose an existential crisis for others, it doesn't for me. To me, it merely means that existence itself is just a part of a bigger entity or force, and if it is never meant to be comprehended in any state, then I feel no shame in not fearing what is impossible to understand at any level. Before I wrap up here on the life and work of Lovecraft, I did mention this video wasn't going to be based on Pokémon primarily, but that doesn't mean that I don't have something to add there for you all. Lovecraft's work has gone far beyond what anyone in his time could have ever thought of in terms of scale, and the terror that things beyond human understanding have been reached by almost any other author, and that means that his work has influenced a massive variety of media over time. And that media also includes Pokémon. As such, before I wrap up this personal tribute, I want to take a brief look at a handful or so of Pokémon that I believe would easily make the cut as being defined as Lovecraftian entities, and the reasons why they deserve to be classified as such. Ditto might seem like an odd choice at first, and in truth, it only gets a mention here at the very beginning for two major reasons. First of all, while it has been made clear officially that Ditto is a natural species, and not the result of a scientific experiment gone wrong, we really don't know a great deal about the origins or what could lead to the genesis of an entity whose entire purpose and powers rely on their capacity to change into other creatures and objects to survive, more than fulfilling the idea of being at least somewhat supernatural to some degree. Secondly, while their transformative powers might be shared by the likes of Mew, the blobby, gelatinous nature of their unnatural physical body resembles in structure that of the Shoggoth, so it's possible there might at least be a degree of inspiration in that sense. The Tau trio as a whole is a bit of a mixed bag on this front, as while two of the three members present in this group, namely Reshiram and Zekrom, were technically created on Earth and therefore on their own do not meet the cosmic horror requirements to be considered truly Lovecraftian, Qrem is known to have come to this world encased in a body of some sort before arriving and impacting on Earth, which to me gives the same vibes as the beginning of The Color Out of Space. Even in its current damaged and incomplete form, the creature exudes powers that are not entirely understood scientifically, but more importantly, the fact that it was able to actually split its form in the sense of creating new entities with mass and minds and physical bodies of their own, yet not enough to the point of actually losing mass of an equal amount in the process, goes against the accepted belief that matter cannot be created nor destroyed, merely converted to something else, completely defying one of the most basic laws of physics. This is the supernatural quality that brings everything together and in turn defines the creatures as a whole trio as genuinely Lovecraftian in nature. The members of the Cosmog family and Necrozma are extra-universal entities in the Pokémon world, having come to our world from universes beyond what a normal person could ever hope to see or encounter, and while the actual manner in which they interact with humanity differs, with the former coming into this world in order to bring stability and peace to the people of the Alola region, among other locations, and the latter coming to steal the light of the world in order to try and restore itself to full power, there is no getting around the fact that this by definition makes them entities of cosmic horror, especially with Necrozma, as it exists as an entity whose power reaches across multiple universes to bathe worlds in the light that can give power to all that are exposed to it. In other words, it is a god of sorts in its own right, as its light is implied to have helped give Pokémon in our world the powers that make them discernible from other living creatures. Moreover, similar to the case of the Tau Trio, these creatures have the power to fuse together, and while they do at least match the mass needed for both parties to count, the fact that the light that powers them can be used to open tears through space and time and into other universes gives the eldritch aspect of their existence more than solid ground to stand on. Alright, now here comes the one that's both easy to speak on, and yet might be a bit of a sour note to others. A lot of people online really seem to think that the Ultra Beast as a whole deserve to be seen as Lovecraftian, but given the definition we have been using to define creatures of that nature here, the truth is that most of them don't qualify at all. It is true that they are all extra-universal entities and thus fulfill the cosmic horror quality just fine, but that's not the real problem. It is the eldritch quality that is the real issue, as a lot of them act and exist as living creatures whose biology is understandable to some degree or another, thus taking away much of the mystery surrounding how they operate as living creatures. There are only 3 in the entire lot that I think really meet the eldritch component of this entire affair: Kartana, Guzzlord, and Blacephalon. Kartana makes the cut, no pun intended, because while it might have a body that is made of a paper of some sort, the fact that it is not only sentient but has the capacity to actually communicate directly with humans and other entities grants it a sense of existence that is impossible to fully understand with current biological science. Second, the obvious poster child here, Guzzlord, is a literal living black hole, as it is able to perfectly convert whatever matter it ingests into pure energy with no waste products. Plus there is the lovely note that is confirmed to have had its design directly inspired by other Lovecraftian entities. Thirdly, Blacephalon is the only ghost-type Ultra Beast for its use of life energy to sustain itself in its abnormal form, which has a low mass despite its large stature, and an exploding head that they can use as a literal weapon and then just regenerate without any permanent effects. As a whole, these 3 really make it clear that not all of the life out there is going to be easy to understand to any degree, just as Lovecraft would have liked. Eternatus is such a strong match for a Lovecraftian entity that it should go without saying, but to make it clear, let's break it down a bit. Just as with the members of the Tau Trio and the Ultra Beast and associated creatures, this entity is extraterrestrial in nature and crash landed on the planet tens of thousands of years ago, only awakening about 3,000 years ago to try and restore its energy after being dormant for so long. The entity is radioactive by nature, a rare poison-type legendary who is not only able to use its radioactive powers to poison others with attacks like cross-poison, but more importantly, serves as the literal source for all Dynamax energy in the Galar region, the sole reason why the Dynamax and Gigantamax phenomena exist in the region at all. This abnormal power is one that can and has been harnessed by humanity in the past, such as by the former chairman of Macrocosmos, Chairman Rose, but at the same time it's not something that we are able to replicate on our own, showing that we are merely users of its power and not masters of it. Our understanding of its powers is still limited in that fashion, and thus more than qualifies it as a source beyond current comprehension, much as its Eternamax Eternatus form is. The Unknown are also an incredibly obvious and powerful example of a Lovecraftian entity, though they stand out from previous examples in that they are not necessarily alien in the way of being from another world or universe, but meet the criteria in a much more direct sense. On the one hand, they more than meet the Eldritch criteria, as while their powers are very weak on their own, when large numbers of these creatures are gathered together, they're able to actually pull the psychic powers together to warp not just the fabric of space-time, but, more devastatingly, warp the very fabric of reality itself, bringing dreams to life in reality, and in turn causing chaos beyond anything that we are currently able to understand, let alone replicate with technology or even other Pokémon for the most part. However, it is seemingly clear that the Unknown are natives to this planet, so how does it come to pass that they meet the cosmic horror aspect here? Well, that one is actually quite simple. While it might be impossible to currently prove, it has been theorized for a long time now that they're actually the living thousand arms that Arceus used to create the universe as we live within, and given that the power to create entire worlds has more than been observed to be within their capabilities, plus the fact that they seem to live in their own pocket dimension when not active, I think we can give them the benefit of the doubt in this instance. Lastly, and certainly not the least, the opposite in fact, we have the Lake Trio, the Creation Trio, and Arceus, and their entry here shouldn't take much of a leap of logic to understand. Uxie, Mesprit, Azelf, Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina all represent fundamental aspects of life and the universe itself, and are all required for it to remain in a stable state of existence. And in the case of the latter 3, their very group name makes it clear that they are the gods that keep it all running in their own way, and with powers that go so far beyond what humanity can normally wield, or at the very least safely, that they more than qualify for both aspects of Lovecraftian horror. And of course there is then Arceus, the creator of the universe as we know it, the literal god of all Pokémon and everything else that we know of. It might as well be the stand-in for Azathoth in this instance, or any other creator god, and its amazing powers are both incredibly unfamiliar and alien to most, and incredible in its capacity to create and destroy whatever it desires, especially among the Unknown as mentioned already. So by default, it makes the list and is the most prominent example of a Lovecraftian entity in the entirety of the world of Pokémon. You know, when I managed to acquire this volume with Lovecraft's work, I initially never really had plans to talk about the man and his work here, but as you can see from all that we have covered here, it was more of a matter of not whether it would make it to this channel, but in what manner. And while I thought it would have been just fine to cover the last bit here on Pokémon that would make sense in this Cthulhu mythos, in the end, it had to be so much more. I had to give him and his work almost all the major spotlight here, because there is not only so much to digest in his work, but so much that I see now has influenced the world as we see it across too many subjects to fully express. Music, literature, physical art, games, film, and TV. There is so much that this one man has touched that it saddens me still that he never really got the chance to see his work become the cultural icon and social influence that it is today, and it baffles me to see how little it was valued until more recent decades. While the man himself might have had his flaws that stand out still today, in the grand scheme of things it is important to understand that the author and the works of his creation can be separated, and for that, I cannot recommend enough that you take the time to look into his work and really take in as much as you can.
H.P. Lovecraft saw a world where the human race was just a small piece of a much greater cosmos that is indifferent to our existence at best, with entities that are beyond even the greatest of scientific minds there. And even now, and to me, there are few other writers that I could ever say have had the same sort of scope to and focus on in their work. Even if it might trigger a sense of existential crisis in those that read into his work, that is the point. To put us in our place and show that we are so little compared to so much that is beyond sight, sound, and comprehension to this very day. Lovecraft is a titan of influence and a father of horror that truly made the world feel that much smaller out there, and for the infinite possibilities that has opened in our view of the greater universe and beyond, I cannot give enough praise. I hope this little tribute to him has brought him more prominently to your attention, and perhaps, if you so choose, into a mythos that challenges any known notions that the story of life as we know it is the story of the human race, instead putting us as a mere footnote within the true story of creation in its entirety. With that, I thank you for tuning in to watch here, and I'll see you all in the next video.